Now, my pleasure right now, though, is not only to thank you all for being here, but to introduce the last speaker of our session. Dr. Kathleen McGuire is an SVSU history professor. She is passionate about what she does, and I think it's wonderful that she will close out our session today with a great topic, Beyond the Great War. Kathleen?
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, I have some words of thanks before I begin, but I'm going to say something just so you can help me keep on track. I'm a mover, I'm a wanderer, and because we are filming, I'm supposed to stay right here. So send me a little wave or a signal if you find me edging too far away from the light where I am supposed to be so they can actually see me. So thank you for helping me out with that. Again, I would like to begin by thanking all of you for being here today and for participating in our first ever Becauses and Effects event. I hope that everyone has enjoyed their day and discovered something new, something interesting, or something enlightening about the experiences of the First World War. I also want to thank and acknowledge all those who contributed to today's event, including the Midland County Historical Society, the Midland Center for the Arts, the Grace A. Dow Library, Saginaw Valley State University, and the Michigan Humanities Council. In addition to the steering committee members and my fellow presenters, I would also like to extend a special thank you to the history students at SVSU who volunteered their Saturday late in the term, I might add, to be here today. Thanks, guys. So, the title of this closing keynote is Beyond the Great War. Obviously, we know that World War I ultimately comes to an end, first with the 1918 Armistice that ended the actual fighting, and then with the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, tying the figurative bow on the experience overall. For many Americans today, the ending of the First World War is seen primarily as a key stepping stone for the conflict we are more sort of comfortable or familiar with, World War II. However, I think that in simply leaping from one global war to the next, we might miss out on exploring how those immediately involved in the Great War struggled to shape the new world that they had emerged into, and tried to make sense of and remember the carnage and chaos of the previous 4 years. And I was actually inspired by Dr. Basler's talk this morning. The idea of assigning blame or guilt really does happen quite immediately and continues on in the memory of the war as well. Additionally, when we're looking at how our society in the United States today remembers World War I, and in particular when we compare that with other participating nations and their commemorations, we might perhaps better understand our own national priorities in considering what makes a war worth remembering. So I'd like to begin by just simply covering the bare basics of the actual ending of the war. And so we begin with Armistice. And the road to Armistice really begins in October of 1918. German military leaders and politicians begin meeting to discuss a ceasefire based on what they hope are the assurances of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which he issued in January of that year. The war, by this point, was beginning to go quite badly for Germany. Certainly the involvement of American troops have a bit of a participation in that. And also within Germany itself, you have growing internal strife, ultimately leading to the Kaiser's abdication in November 9th due to workers' and sailors' revolts. So we're finally able to gather the key military figures together on this train car. And on November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., and of course it's important to note, Paris time. The agreement was actually signed at 5 a.m. local time. We begin to see the elements of peace starting to take shape. The immediate beginning includes, in the armistice, German demilitarization. So I think it's really interesting to note that before any nations basically agree to anything, the point of demilitarizing Germany is key. All the other big issues of who owns what, how do we assign blame, or do we, what to do about perhaps moving forward with peace, those are to be settled at the Paris Peace Conference in the coming months. I want to talk about the Paris Peace Conference in just a moment, but I think it would be helpful before we move forward to actually talk about some of the big numbers. So these are some bare basic statistics for the Allies, and it's listed based on basically numbers of troops mobilized. So that's how they're listed here. So we can see that Russia actually mobilizes the most troops for the Allies with 12 million. And considering all of the issues that Russia had ultimately leading to its own revolution in 1917, that's a pretty amazing statistic. In that period of time in which they participated in World War I, 1.7 million Russians were killed. Next up, in terms of actual troop mobilization, was the British Empire. And of course, when we say empire, we literally mean a global empire with troops coming from every corner of the globe that the British occupied. And so we're talking about Australians, South Africans, Indians, Canadians. And so when we look at the number of troops mobilized as well as the number of troops killed, we can perhaps see how Britain's remembrance of this war will become very powerful. France, again, mobilizes the next most amount, Italy, the United States, and so on. Japan's an interesting case when looking at the numbers, 800,000 mobilized versus 300 killed. So when we add those totals with the Central Powers, Germany mobilizes 11 million troops with 1.773 million killed. Austria-Hungary, 7.8 million. With the carnage of this war, the actual devastation in terms of lives is enormous. And so if you wanted to put real numbers to that, it leads to 65 million troops mobilized in a 4-year war and roughly 8.5 million killed. So obviously, moving forward out of this war, remembering just the actual devastating loss of life might be key to understanding how this war matters to certain nations, perhaps sometimes even more than others. So let's take a look now at the actual process of creating the Treaty of Versailles itself, and in particular, the issue of global realignment. The picture I have up on the right is of a group that will be known as the Big Four. So when these negotiations began, originally they were intended to have a council of 10 nations leading the negotiations, and that quickly narrowed down to the Big Four. Lloyd George representing the United Kingdom, Vittorio Orlando representing Italy, George Clemenceau for France, and Woodrow Wilson for the United States. And then the Big Four fairly quickly was whittled down to the Big Three. Basically, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. And I think when we see what some of the actual results of this treaty are, perhaps it will make sense considering who was actually really making the big decisions. So what kind of decisions did they come to? Well, first, I find it fascinating that in the process of negotiating peace, the actual signing of the treaty occurs on the 5-year anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This is clearly intentional, and so again, considering the topic that we started with this morning of assigning blame and remembering this war as who has guilt and who does not, I think when you're picking for your ending of the war, the assassination many consider begins the war, you are definitely making a statement that says, this is a war in which we have good guys and bad guys, and we know who's who, even though we know that's quite a bit more complicated than this suggests. Included in this treaty are continued military restrictions, particularly for Germany, and we can see that was a concern even in the Armistice. I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about territorial shifts here in a minute, because in addition to figuring out what to do about Germany's territories, there are a number of other elements to consider, including in Woodrow Wilson's own 14 points, this new or new-ish concept of self-determination. And Woodrow Wilson himself admitted a few years later, I had no idea what I meant when I said self-determination. I think he just thought it sounded nice. And so, unfortunately, it might help to define what you mean before you say it. The issue of reparations has definitely gained a lot of attention in history about Germany, again, essentially being assigned blame by having to pay for the winning nations. And then, of course, the creating of the League of Nations comes out of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles as well. And there's a lot of interesting elements to creating this international governing body that you are hoping will settle many of those disputes that had originally led to World War I. You hope to have this body now be able to do that moving forward. No more war, of course. Well, let's take a look at these shifting boundaries, because I think if we're talking about the long-term memory and significance of World War I, how boundaries and borders shaped, and in particular those connections with ideas of nationalism, this idea of shared languages, cultures, customs, ethnicities, religions, and in particular borders, and the importance of adopting that identity and fighting for that identity are going to continue to resonate, I think, as we will clearly see even today. When we start our shifting borders and boundaries, I'm going to start with Europe, and I'll explain why. It wasn't my first choice, but you'll understand in just a moment. But we'll look at pre-World War I Europe, and I apologize if it's a bit fuzzy. Pulling maps off of the internet, you get what quality you get. So for instance, if we take a look, here we have Germany and Austria-Hungary. We have the remnants of the Ottoman Empire sitting here and the Russian Empire right here. And in post-World War I Europe, basically the realigning of boundaries, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, we've made some fairly significant changes that continue to influence the course of European history, I think up to the present day, and certainly had a more immediate effect in the post-World War I period. So we create these brand new nations of Poland and Czechoslovakia, and in fact, Poland's Independence Day celebrations usually take place on Armistice Day. We split up Austria and Hungary, and oh yeah, everything else, into Austria and Hungary, create Yugoslavia out of the Balkan situation. So we really see quite a few shifting boundaries, and of course with that, the people themselves have always had consistent identities, language, cultures, and customs, and now you're trying to shape those boundaries to fit those people or maybe not fit those people. But the story of basically Europe's reshaping should be fairly familiar to us. We understand the long-term issues of Poland and Czechoslovakia. What maybe we don't think so much about, and oh wow, that didn't come out spectacular at all, sorry, but actually completely 100% reinforces the point I will make, so that works. Let's talk about everyone else. Because European borders were not the only ones that shifted and changed in this period. A number of places in Africa were basically passed around like baseball trading cards. If we start with Cameroon, right here, they basically went from a German-occupied territory to a French-occupied territory. Congratulations. Togo, basically the same story, only they go to the British. German East Africa was clearly a place that many people were interested in, and so it was divided up three ways. Belgium received the portions that become Rwanda and Burundi. Portugal receives the Kayunga Triangle, and the United Kingdom receives Tanganyika, and it merges it with Zanzibar to form Tanzania. Obviously, the peoples who lived in these areas did not receive much of a choice in the shifting of ownership, in the shifting of these boundaries from German to French or from German to British, or in the case of German Southwest Africa, right here, the shift from German ownership to South African ownership. So the process of self-determination, a nation deciding for themselves what kind of nation they wanted to be, doesn't seem to apply to the continent of Africa, perhaps Asia. Again, this is fantastic, don't worry. It's a terrible map and there's a reason. Asia is a different story. Japan, which had those 300 casualties, Basically, their sort of role in the war was to look out for German territories or concessions and take them over as quickly and easily as possible, which they did a great job of. So any German Pacific islands, including the Marshall Islands, now went under Japanese control. The Chinese delegation to the Paris Peace Conference asked that the German concessions that had been granted in China be returned to the Chinese people, and they were denied. Those concessions were instead handed over to Japan. So perhaps Japan's own process of imperialization is continuing with the assistance of nations like France, the United Kingdom, even the United States. So China has denied those German territories, and in fact are so upset and frustrated, they refuse to sign the Treaty of Paris and instead sign their own separate agreements. Korea sends a delegation. They had been long fought over. Unfortunately, they're really hard to see over here. They had been long fought over by Russia, by China, by Japan, and are ultimately annexed by Japan in 1911. They came to the Paris Peace Conference in the hopes of asking for their own nation, independence, and were denied a hearing. And in a very famous and popular story several decades later, a waiter at the Ritz in Paris, who we now know as Ho Chi Minh, sent a letter on behalf of the people of Vietnam requesting a petition for hearing on self-determination for that not yet a nation. Because Vietnam was under French control at that period of time, the negotiations being held in Paris, again, perhaps it is self-explanatory why this group was also denied any kind of hearing on self-determination. This is where I'm sad about the maps. My apologies. They look great on the screen, and they look horrible on the screen over here. It's in the Middle East, where we perhaps see some of the most striking shifting of boundaries and borders, which we can most directly tie also into issues and conflicts of today. The creation of the nation of Turkey, which was a long and evolving process of revolution within the nation and also outside influence, is a part of this process of reshaping boundaries. Breaking up the rest of the Ottoman Empire took several different forms. The first was the French Mandate, which created the modern borders of today Syria and Lebanon. So what is today Syria comes from the ending of World War I and the French possession of Syria. British Mandate included Palestine and what is considered Transjordan, or what today would mostly be Jordan, and also what they termed Mesopotamia, or what we know of today as Iraq. And again, modern Iraq's boundaries come from this war. Finally, the creation of the new nations of Saudi Arabia and Yemen are a result of all of these negotiations, treaties, some of which include the participation of the people who live there, who are from there, and some who do not. So again, I said I'm glad the maps are a bit of a mess, and there's a reason why, and it's something I wanted to share with you. When I started the process of putting this whole keynote together, this was something I very much wanted to talk about, and of course maps are essential to understanding the shifting of borders and boundaries. So like any good student I have, the first place I would start would be the internet. So I type into Google, and I want to make sure I get the right phrase here, territory changes after World War I. A very general phrase, which I hoped would allow me not just the European changes, but any other territorial changes. 90% of all of the maps that came up on my screen were of Europe. And so I said, okay, well, I maybe shouldn't be as surprised as I am. After all, I've done this enough. So then I typed in territory changes in Africa, post-World War I. And the maps I have found, I couldn't read, which is similar enough to your experience at the moment. I typed in territory changes in Asia, and the maps were literally either Europe, 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 Middle East, Europe, Middle East. And so there's nothing about the changes happening in China or Japan taking over German territories in the Pacific. And then I typed in territorial changes in the Middle East. I did find some more, because obviously this is a very current topic, and so people are interested. But again, the quality of the maps, trying to actually make sense of those changes, was incredibly difficult. So perhaps, again, it is no surprise that you can really see the boundaries and the changes and the shifts on these two maps and not here. So this leads me to sort of the final area I want to talk about, which is that this is clearly a global war. So why is the memory of it so European? And in fact, to help me demonstrate that, to me, this is one of the most striking remembrances of the war that I think I've ever seen. This is from the Tower of London in 2014. As a commemoration, they commissioned an artist who created, I believe they're ceramic red poppies, one poppy for every single person killed in World War I. So that was over 880,000 ceramic red poppies that they then placed throughout basically what is the moat of the Tower of London. And the visual of it is absolutely devastating because it looks like blood. And it just gives you that reminder. And so if this is perhaps the most striking image of remembering the war 100 years later, why is it coming from here and not any of these other places who are profoundly impacted to this day? I think the answer to this, it comes in two parts. The first is how the war was remembered in the immediate aftermath, both with the things we've seen in terms of the changes of the Treaty of Versailles, but also in the choices people made in the actual commemoration acts that come with remembering the war. So one of the first official commemorations comes with assigning a specific day of memory, a Remembrance Day, or sometimes termed Armistice Day, sort of depending on where you were from. The United States at first called it Armistice Day, and it was first celebrated in 1919 by Woodrow Wilson, officially calling it a day of remembrance. The United Kingdom also in that year began celebrating a Remembrance Day, and all the other Commonwealth nations adopted that same principle and practice. France and Belgium also created Remembrance Days. Interestingly enough, Germany does not pick Armistice Day or November 11th to serve as a commemoration. Russia does not. Couldn't find any on Austria or Hungary or any of these other places. So picking a particular date, and in fact the date of armistice for commemorating your war, is an interesting choice. One of the other things that develop is the creation of the Tombs of the Unknown Soldier, and this speaks to perhaps the size of the devastation. Remember, 65 million mobilized, over 8.5 million killed. And so many of them killed in such a way as to be unrecognizable, and before our modern DNA techniques, literally unidentifiable. And so what the United States, United Kingdom, and France decided to do is to select a body that was unidentified, an unknown soldier, and to give them a national formal burial and a place of remembrance that would look something like this. And again, I apologize for the quality. This is from the 1920s, and this is the United States' first unknown soldier tomb. So this process of remembering by selecting the unknown, the unidentifiable, the common man who gave his life and we don't even know his name, was one of the really key and important elements in remembering this war. Another thing that happens, again, particularly in Commonwealth nations, which I find interesting, is the creation of something called cenotaphs, which I'll be honest, I had to look up what a cenotaph was. I had certainly seen this before. Any picture you have of any parade in London, they go by this cenotaph, which goes up Whitehall Street. A cenotaph is basically an empty tomb. It's an empty tomb meant to symbolize, again, all of the bodies who could not be physically buried in their home. And so the cenotaph became a major symbol in commemorating and remembering the war. But what I found most interesting in all of the things I've looked at and read in my own personal travels and experiences is that commemorating and remembering World War I, particularly in the immediate aftermath, was a process that really happened in local towns and communities. I have had the privilege and honor of participating in a couple of study abroad programs with SVSU, going through London and through England generally. I've also had some just personal experiences there. And the number of towns that have in its town center some kind of memorial to World War I, specifically World War I, not all wars, but that war, is mind-blowing. I tried to take pictures of them all and literally had to stop because my files were full. So it's interesting to see how Americans choose that. Many towns, many cities did form some sort of memorial to World War I soldiers, sometimes in the form of perhaps a hospital, a street name, perhaps a coliseum, an auditorium, sometimes with statues. As a local community, remember the war. And I have articles and editorials from both the Midland Republican and the Midland Sun on the results of this discussion. From the Midland Republican on January 6, 1919, no new courthouse nor soldiers' memorial. Such is the verdict of a majority of the members of the Board of Supervisors. Regardless of the sentiment, the first is a necessity and the second highly desirable and commendable. The supervisors who voted against the proposition undoubtedly had good personal reasons for the stand they took, but in a matter which is of such vital interest to everybody in this county who has a relative or dear friend in the military service of this community and nation, we are strongly of the opinion that the question should have been submitted directly to the people for them to adopt or reject, thereby letting the majority rule. So in a war to save democracy, the people of Midland were feeling that democracy was not in action in terms of remembering those who served. From the Midland Sun on March 13th, 1919. Here, again, in the essence of the original proposition, shall the people of Midland County, the patriotic people, yes, and the unpatriotic, be permitted to speak for themselves at the polls and decide for themselves whether or not they, the people, shall dig down in their own jeans and erect a memorial courthouse in honor of their boys, who faced death and the hell of Flanders Fields. 12 supervisors voted to permit the people to decide the question. 13 stood between the people of Midland County and the right to decide for themselves what they should do with their own money. So the issue of whether to memorialize soldiers from World War I in this particular community right here was a heated one, playing out in the papers and Board of Supervisor votes, and ultimately led to no memorial being created for World War I soldiers. So now let's look at today. How do we remember World War I today, first as a nation and also globally? Well, when we're talking about Remembrance Day, I have to say it's interesting, and I hate to throw my good students under the bus with this one, but when I taught my World War I class, or indeed when I bring this up in my survey classes, and I say, okay, how many of you know what day Veterans Day is? What does it mean? Where does it come from? Not a lot of them know that it has any kind of connection to the First World War. And the reason for this is that in the United States, what was Armistice Day became Veterans Day in 1954. A World War II veteran from Alabama spent several years petitioning Congress to change the name of the day so that World War II veterans could also be included in this celebration or Remembrance Day. So the United States Congress in 1954 passed a resolution that, yes, in fact, this will now be Veterans Day, and so we include all veterans, living and dead, in this honor and celebration. And I'm certainly not saying there's anything wrong with honoring our veterans. However, in the process, you do lose the significance of that day to that war. You forget why you started celebrating it or remembering it in the first place. So this image, I think, kind of gives us a sense of it's less about any one particular war and about the military in general. Let's talk about unknown soldiers. Again, the United States was not alone in its creation of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. This also happens in other places, particularly France and the United Kingdom. And in fact, in the United Kingdom, it's got a pretty prominent place, Westminster Abbey. So the place where they crown kings and queens, the place where very popular royal weddings tend to occur, is where the World War I unknown soldier lies. And in fact, again, that is so important that when you have the sort of aisle coming down, the Queen herself goes around. Every other subject goes around. That soldier is given prominence over royalty. So in the United States, our Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, again, changes over time. After World War II, again, we have a fair number of soldiers who, based on the carnage and destruction of this war, are unidentifiable. And so they have, I think, 2 from World War II that have been interned in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And when Korea came around several years later, there were 4 unknown soldiers buried there. And then after that, in the Vietnam War. So the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Washington, D.C., again, is not about World War I so much as all 20th century wars. And to add just one more thought onto that, we do have enough technology nowadays to start identifying people who are unidentifiable. And so the soldier from Vietnam who was buried in Vietnam, exhumed, reburied with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, his family basically kind of pursued this and really felt certain that this was their son and brother. The family actually pursued DNA testing and were able to prove that, in fact, this unknown soldier was known. And his family requested that his body again be exhumed, and he was then reinterred in a family plot, I believe, in Indiana. So now the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier no longer has a representative from the Vietnam War. But again, we can see this is less about remembering the First World War as its own unique event and more about tying it into the service of the military in general, at least here in the United States. I have up here also poppies and pop culture, and I don't know, it might not come through as clearly, but surrounding the Westminster Abbey tomb are poppies, and I believe many of you may be familiar with this story. The poem in 1915, In Flanders Field, was written by a Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, a Canadian. This poem became incredibly popular throughout the war, and this idea of the red poppy that survives this horrible carnage, death, and destruction, and still grows in the fields of Flanders, became a really important symbol post-World War I. In fact, it was an American, a woman who was a professor at the University of Georgia, who made the decision to wear a red poppy for a whole year in remembrance of those who fought and died in World War I. And then she herself actually participated in serving in World War I. She worked for the YWCA in New York. She spent some time helping to coordinate some of their efforts there. She saw in the post-war period how World War I veterans, at least in the United States, struggled to carry on with their lives in terms of jobs and employment, in terms of medical treatment and care, in terms of returning to homes and families after this incredible experience. So she coordinated with the American Legion to begin making silk red poppies and then selling them as a fundraiser for the American Legion. And when it became so successful that nationwide people were wearing their red poppies, she wrote to the British and the French legions as well. And they began the process and practice of doing this. So much so that if you go anywhere in the British Commonwealth, again today, particularly say in November, the red poppy is everywhere. It's so much a part of the culture that if you're not wearing a red poppy in these times. It calls into question your patriotism. So something that was started by an American, we continue to no longer practice today. It's very rare to find a red poppy on November 11th in the United States. In terms of pop culture, again, we in the United States certainly have seen some nice movies, plays related to World War I, but the level that World War I plays in pop culture in, again, places like the United Kingdom is amazing. What I have up here in this image of Christmas 1914 refers to the Christmas truce of 1914 and this amazing moment where a game of soccer broke out on Christmas Eve between the German and the British lines. This was turned into an advertisement for a grocery store chain. Every Christmas, the grocery store chains and department stores of the United Kingdom hold what we would consider Super Bowl level advertising competitions. And so the December 2014 entry by Sainsbury's literally featured a 10-minute ad that played out this moment from World War I. It did cause quite a bit of debate. There were some who felt that this was perhaps a bit crass. But nonetheless, this is literally something that everybody knew and understood the minute it came on their screens. There's a reason why they picked this theme and this topic. Everybody knew the story. So what does that mean for us here in the United States? What kinds of celebrations or commemorations do we have when we think back on this war? Well, I do want to give Midland a fair amount of credit in revitalizing its own Veterans Memorial due to some natural weathering as well as some interest in making additions. The committee who revitalized and refurbished the Midland Veterans Memorial decided to include a plaque for Midland County World War I residents who were killed during World War I. My own class of students spent some time investigating that process and found that it's not easy to figure out who should be listed. There might have been some omissions. There's perhaps some misspellings. And part of that is because the records themselves are not easily available. And so it took almost 100 years for Midland County to finally recognize those who served in World War I. And we still might have a little bit of work left to do, and we're going to continue to work on that. So we as a nation do have plans and intentions to commemorate the centennial of the First World War with our own entry in 1917. But we didn't start making those plans until 2013. That's when Congress created the U.S. World War I Centennial Commission. And in fact, I placed on here a website that they have put out in case you are interested in continuing investigating this, want to continue to participate in World War I centennial events, because they are trying to do a lot of really big and interesting work in making World War I an American participated war again, to have Americans be able to celebrate, commemorate, and understand this conflict in ways we perhaps still don't. One of their main goals is the creation of a national World War I memorial. There is no currently national memorial in Washington, D.C. to World War I. They are in the process of fundraising, designing, and selecting that memorial. The World War I Commission also has a project that I find fascinating called Forgotten Memorials. Those who are interested or in towns where they had World War I memorials but have since been overgrown, ignored, deteriorated, you can actually either look for those, or if you know of one, add it to the list and look in ways to help revitalize those memorials. They obviously have a huge mission of education, trying to help Americans better understand a war that we tend to forget. Finally, they coordinate events of commemoration, and I can't help but say this, sell memorabilia on their website of the World War I centennial. So I imagine, though I cannot confirm this, that the funds raised through the sale of memorabilia will help go towards this commemoration, particular the National Monument, but I would have to double check on that. So in conclusion, when we think about moving beyond the Great War, what I always want students of mine to understand, and people who I talk to about World War I to understand, is that if you use World War I to skip ahead to World War II, you're missing out on the experiences of a lot of extraordinary people who really put their lives on the line and many times sacrificed their lives to participate in something bigger than themselves. And we tend to lose that recognition because it's been shaded by other 20th century events, sometimes quite understandably, but also, I think, sometimes quite sadly. And so I hope that the time we have now spent together today in talking about these things inspires us to continue thinking about World War I as its own unique event, worthy of study, worthy of consideration, and worthy of remembrance. Thank you very much.
Wow, what a day, huh? You're probably all about so saturated, aren't you? You just don't know what to do with all this information. I'm Melissa Barnard. I'm the director of the Grace A. Dow Memorial Library, and I was hoping that you could just take in one more little bit of history about World War I. Do you think you can do that? It won't be long. The Library War Services was established by the American Library Association in 1917 to provide library services to American soldiers in training camps and serving overseas in World War I. Between 1917 and 1920, the American Library Association raised $5 million from public donations, erected 36 camp libraries, distributed 7 to 10 million books and magazines, and provided library collections to more than 500 locations, including military hospitals. The Library War Services also provided books in Braille to soldiers that were blinded in battle. I didn't want you to leave without knowing what the connection to libraries is in World War I. We're so pleased to host this wonderful conference and to partner with the Midland County Historical Society and also with Saginaw Valley State University. In your program, you saw the members, the names of the members of the Because and Effects Conference Committee. We all worked very hard, and I think it was well over a year that we have been planning this conference. So we are so pleased to see you all here. We are also very fortunate that we had such incredible speakers who were willing to share their expertise and their research with us today. Can we give a hand to those speakers? And obviously there were many others involved in helping to put this conference together. We want to thank the Michigan Humanities Council for their grant that supported this conference. We also, and I need to thank our staff who put so much time together to prepare this facility to have you here today. And I especially want to thank Ron Beacom, manager of MCTV and Library Communications, who came in to help with any technology challenges we had. And yes, we had those, but I'm hoping you didn't notice them because he's so good at helping me get out of all those issues with technology. And you know, I finally want to thank you for coming today, spending your day with us, networking together, sharing your thoughts, and I know when you leave today, the conversations about World War I will continue. Will continue with your families, your friends, and other members of the community. I don't want to keep you much longer. I know you've been sitting all day. So again, we appreciate you coming. Hope you enjoyed the day. And please fill out those evaluations so we know how to move forward as we evaluate this program. Thank you very much.